All right, let's come back to order here. We're down to item K, which is report acceptance field trial of messenger line throwing device. That's with Joe Raleigh and Peter Souls of Glosten. So Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, this is Joe Lally. I'm the Director of Programs, and I just wanted to introduce this project. And first, I'd like to give a little bit of background. Last year, the council contracted with Glosten to evaluate the technologies available to pass or deploy towing lines to vessels in distress to determine what constitutes best available technology. So as a follow-on to that project was well received by board members as well as stakeholders. So as a follow-on to that project, Glosten was hired to evaluate the effectiveness of those line throwing devices that were identified as best available technology through field trials with the device manufacturers. And then through these field trials were conducted on June 15th in Puget Sound. And I'd just like to thank the PWSRCAC committee, Alan Sorum, who's the project manager, as well as Mike Day from SERVS, who attended the line throwing field trials from Valdez. And then last but not least, I would just like to introduce Peter Souls and Kevin Raleigh, who will be giving the presentation today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. We'll get right into it. Jennifer, if you can set up Kevin for screen share.
I think I've got it going here.
Okay.
So as long as everyone can see my screen, I think we're good to get started.
Yep.
So as Joe very nicely introduced us, my name is Kevin Raleigh, and I'm here with Peter Souls from Glosten, and we're going to talk about the trials that we conducted in June to try to identify best available emergency tow line deployment technology. So let's get started. So I'm going to skip a little bit of the background because Joe very nicely covered it. So I'm going to jump right into why would we like to evaluate tow line deployment technology? And why do we care specifically about that step when it comes to identifying the important parts of connecting with a vessel that's in distress? And it's mostly because that part of the process, when we have a tug that approaches a disabled vessel and has to make a connection so that can establish a towing connection and tow the vessel to safety, that part of the process carries with it a serious inherent risk, and that comes from a number of different things. So number one might be that the proximity between the vessels. So if you've got a vessel that's drifting in wind and waves, and you've got a tug that has to maneuver to establish a line between the vessel and itself, the proximity of those two vessels leads to a risk for the crew, for the vessels themselves, for the cargo. Similarly, you might have weather conditions. The wind and the waves themselves are working against you. Depending on how close you are to shore, time might be of the essence as you try to stop this vessel from coming near environmental factors, breaking up on rocks, things like that, causing significant damage. And also the location. It could have influences on how far you are from having a collision, but also on how long it takes for a tug to meet up with that disabled vessel and start the whole process. So as Joe talked about, Glosten performed a previous study where we tried to identify a best available tow line deployment technology, and that was done in May of 2020. And that consisted of a literature review where we looked at the different regulatory bodies and what they specify as far as technological requirements on rescue vessels, and how that has influenced the state of the industry, what technology is out there right now, what's being used right now. And to that end, we looked at some relevant incidences. So we looked at what vessels have had to have this interaction, establishing a tow line connection, and we tried to identify what are the lessons learned, how could we improve our processes on these, and what technology could have really fit as in terms of helping those processes along. So we recommended some technologies based on our evaluation and presented them as the best available. And the outcome of that study was that we recommended 3 main types of devices. So those were pyrotechnic devices. These are devices that fire a projectile that has some fuel or propellant that allows the projectile to go above and beyond the disabled vessel and drop a line that it carries aboard the vessel so that the 2 crews can pass a messenger line and then the towing gear. These devices are long range, they're easy to use. They tend to be single shot devices because once the fuel is spent, the device is done, it's ready to be discarded. Then there are pneumatic devices. These operate in a similar way, except instead of using a fuel or a propellant, they use compressed air. And because of this, they have a passive projectile. This is of particular interest when we're talking about tanker vessels, where we want to avoid having any sort of incendiary projectile near flammable cargo, near crew, near anything on deck that might pose a hazard if exposed to that flame. And because these devices operate with using compressed air, another benefit of them is that they're reusable. This is significant when it comes to giving crews the opportunity to use these in practicing and in drilling so that they can be comfortable using these technologies so that in terms of a rescue situation, they're effective and efficient in their use. And then lastly, we identified surface float lines. These are slightly different. They're dropped from a disabled vessel. And then they have some sort of drag anchor, which allows the line to stream out to a safe distance where the tug can sweep in, pick them out of the water. And because they're not subject to the wind in the way that the other line throwers are, they're more suited to heavy weather where that wind might deflect your line or make it difficult to establish that connection. And another benefit of these is that they don't have that light cordage that the line throwers do. So you save yourself a step in passing the towing gear between the vessels. So that leads us to what was the purpose of our trial in June after this. And we really wanted to explore what are the practical characteristics. So what is it like to use these devices on board instead of what does it look like when we look at these devices and compare their spec sheets. And secondly, we wanted to evaluate that study's findings. We wanted to compare and see how do those specs line up with the actual use case. That leads me to my next point, which is that we wanted to identify how do these devices work under real world conditions. We didn't want to fire these on land and say that they were accurate or inaccurate. We wanted to get out on the water and fire them as close to the real use case as we could, and then identify any differences between the specs and the real use. So that leads us to our trial. So we took out a couple of tugs and a barge, and one of the tugs was made up to the barge so that we could simulate a drifting disabled vessel. That would be the tug and barge in the background on your screen. And in the foreground, you see our rescue tug that we fired the devices from across to the barge so that we could simulate what it would be like to try to make contact with that disabled vessel. The line throwers that we looked at were these 4. So the Restec PLT Solus was our #1 recommended device from the previous study. It's a pneumatic device designed specifically for Solus regulations. The Restec PLT Multi is a very similar device, almost the same design, but it has a few multi-purpose projectiles. For example, it has a grappling hook for use in picking lines out of the water. So it's a slightly different design. The Boomerang BLT 250 is sort of the more cost-effective version of the PLT devices made by a different manufacturer, but it's also a pneumatic device, operates the same way using compressed air. And then finally, the pyrotechnic device that we tested was the Icaros line thrower. This one had the longest range. It was a single-use propellant-based line thrower. And what we were looking for when we were testing these devices were 4 main categories. We identified these before the trial as ease of use, which we broke down into ergonomics. How does it feel to use these devices? Is the user impeded in any way by its form? Weight, similarly. Is the device too heavy to be aimed accurately? Effectiveness, we broke down into the range of the device. How far can it fire? Can it, allow the tug to sit at a safe distance when it fires the projectile to the disabled vessel. And then accuracy and wind deflection. We need to be able to hit the disabled vessel, hopefully on our first try. So we want these devices to be accurate and reliable. In terms of reliability, we wanted to look at how uniform was the range. Was it hitting about the same distance every time, or was it all over the place? We need to know that these devices are going to perform as expected every single time. How easy were they to reload? And then finally, what was the safety like? Did the operator feel that they had full control over the device, or did they feel that there was some sort of risk while they were firing it? And then during testing, a couple of criterion came up that we felt we really needed to add to our analysis that we hadn't anticipated. And these were the crosswind line deflection. So what I mean by that is when we're firing perpendicular to the wind, we noticed that even when the projectile flew straight, the line that was attached to it often was caught by the wind and drifted downwind and missed its target. And I'll show that a little bit more clearly on the next slide. And on the other item that we identified was the build quality of the devices. And we didn't anticipate that the materials and the manufacture of these devices would have such a serious impact on not only their performance, but also their safety and their reliability. So as I said, I wanted to show the line deflection in action. So this is an aerial view of what our test looked like. And on the left, you can see our rescue tug where we fire the devices from. And on the right, you can see the barge that's made up to the other tug simulating our disabled vessel. And we're going to fire the Icaros right over the top of the barge. So you can see the projectile as it's fired, goes clean over the barge, and it lands right about there in the water. And it's kind of hard to see on your screens, but after firing, the line was still in the air and it got caught by the wind and it got dragged all the way down and around the barge. So even though the operator fired directly over the barge, landed the projectile in the water on the other side of it, if this had been a real world scenario, they would have had to fire again so that they could get the line on the barge of the disabled vessel and able to be picked up. So that's why we had to identify this additional criteria. And similarly, we identified the device build quality as being an issue. When we noticed things like you'll see in this video, when the boomerang was fired, because it was made of plastic, it sort of blew apart upon firing, and the pieces not only posed a safety risk, but also impacted the performance of the device and made it so that it didn't fly quite as well as the other devices that we tested. So you'll see the boomerang right now as I play this, and as it's fired, the rocket breaks up and parts of it are thrown across the deck, and the remaining part didn't fly quite as straight as it should have. So now I'll turn it to Peter to talk about our surface float line system.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so part of the test was evaluation of line throwing devices, and the other part was evaluation of surface float lines, because our previous report identified these as a viable tool that offered particular advantages for nearshore emergency towing when time was really of the essence and where weather, namely wind and wave heights, were a real concern and could potentially impede passage of a line with a line throwing device. So to evaluate a surface float line system, the one we opted to look at, since these aren't really, they're not manufactured all over the place, and in a lot of cases they're almost stovepiped on deck, improvised. But Samson does make they make the EVATS system, which is an emergency towing kit that Glosten actually developed as part of a previous project. So, but that kit in itself it's kind of like the Alaska emergency towing system. It's a complete towing kit, and what we wanted to do here is isolate just the retrieving line. So that upper piece there with the green bridle and the blue, that's the towing gear. So we left that part out of it. And if you advance the slide a bit, Kevin, this is what we looked at and evaluated as far as a surface float line. We had Samson manufacture this for this trial. And what sets it apart from just being a piece of floating rope is namely that it has this drag anchor that is spliced onto the body of the line towards the end there. this schematic is a little deceiving because the line is actually over 100 meters long, and the pilot anchor and all these floats and such are out towards the end. But as Kevin mentioned earlier, and he'll demonstrate this in a bit, when that pilot anchor inflates as the barge is drifting downwind, then it pulls the whole retrieving system up in a straight line upwind, where a tug can swoop in and toss a grapple between those two floats and recover the system at a safe distance. So this is what we looked at as far as the surface float line system. It's one component of the broader EVATS kit. So don't confuse those two. What we're looking at here is not EVATS. It's just representative of how a surface float line system should be constructed.
Yeah, so now we'll talk a little bit about the outcomes of this trial and how we went about assessing the performance of each of the devices. So we captured drone footage aerially of every one of the shots, and we captured stills like you see here. And using that, we were able to determine the distance from the tug to the barge, as well as the angles between where the operators were aiming and where the projectile actually went, the attitude of the line in the water. And we could capture everything and really give a quantifiable answer to how each device scored against those different criteria that I talked about a little bit earlier. So the outcome of that scoring was that the devices received the scores that you see there on the right. So the ResTech devices both got a 97 out of 100. The ICRO scored just a little bit lower with a 96, and the Boomerang received a 90. And the reason I want to pull up these scores and show them to you is I want to identify one point about the build quality, which is that the ResTech devices and the Boomerang were nearly identical in design in terms of their function. They were both pneumatic devices, but the ResTechs really outperformed the Boomerang, specifically because of those build quality issues that I mentioned before. The Boomerang's performance really did suffer because of things like the projectiles breaking and the housing of the device not being made to the same spec as the ResTech devices. So that is a significant thing to consider when it comes to looking into these devices. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about what we can take away from those scores. You might have noticed all the devices scored within the 90 to 100 range. And that's because they're all quite effective at doing what they're meant to do. But the real differences came about because of their range and accuracy ratings. So what I mean is their fundamentals in terms of their ergonomics and weight, how easily they were reloaded, their safety, all those things were very good. They all performed quite well. But in terms of range, that's where their differences really showed up. So the Pyrotechnic devices, as I mentioned, have a distinct range advantage. Every time we fired them, they went clear over the barge, really outperforming the others in terms of range, which isn't to say that the pneumatics did poorly. They met the test requirements. They all hit the barge or went past it as they were expected to, but the Pyrotechnics really shone in the range category. And then on the flip side, with accuracy, the Pyrotechnics, largely due to their design, were the hardest to aim, and they seemed to be the most susceptible to deflection. And part of this had to do with the shot line that they had attached, which was of not quite the same quality as the pneumatic devices, which led to it being pulled downwind because it had a little bit more windage. The pneumatics, on the other hand, were incredibly precise, very easy to aim, and didn't really suffer that same wind deflection, or at least not the same magnitude of it. In terms of the results from the float line test, the float line did exactly what we expected it to do, and it performed exactly as designed. It deployed from the disabled vessel, which was in a simulated drift, being pulled by the tug that was made up to it, and it streamed out directly away from it, giving a lot of room for the rescuing tug to sweep in and pull the line on board between its buoys. The buoys were clearly visible, easily recoverable on the surface. So like Peter mentioned, I'm going to show right now the pilot anchor as it's being inflated in the water. So you can see right at the top there, it's in red and yellow. We've got sort of an underwater parachute, and it's going to catch the water, and it's going to start to inflate, and that's what's going to let it drag in the water behind the drifting ship, and it's going to allow the line to stream out. So there it is, fully inflating, and you can see the line almost getting taut there as it's being pulled away behind the barge drifting. So that is ideal for a situation where you have a disabled vessel that can drop this in the water and allow it to stream out while a rescue tug is coming to recover it before it's even come to the area that the disabled vessel is in. So let's talk just a little bit about the significance that comes from these results. And I'll start with the pneumatic devices. So as I've said, these were highly accurate, they were easy to use, and they hit all of the points that we set out for them perfectly. They really achieved what they set out to do. And for the purposes of this council, I'd like to point out the benefits of having a passive projectile. It really makes them ideal for tanker operations. It adds a lot of peace of mind to not have to worry about having some sort of flaming projectile going towards a tanker vessel, both in terms of the cargo and in terms of the crew. So you're going to see here your own Alan Sorum firing one of those devices towards our barge. And it goes straight over. And it might be a little hard to see on your screens, but it went clear over the other side and landed the line right on the barge. The Pyrotechnic Devices really can't overstate their exceptional range capability. In another use case, these would be excellent open water where you're not worried about flammable cargo. They were slightly more difficult to aim. So as you can see there, Peter's got one on his leg, and that's how you have to fire it from the thigh. So you can't exactly aim down the barrel like you could with the pneumatic devices, which made them a little bit harder to aim and harder to get that accuracy. And as I said, the incendiary projectile is the real safety risk there. So you can see how the propellant comes out here when it's fired. And don't worry, we've got another video of Alan firing one too. So as you can see, it goes clear over the barge. If you can catch it on the other side.
Yep, you can see the line deflection there too that Kevin was talking about, where immediately it just starts blowing downwind because this particular nylon line they used was twisting as it deployed, and so that created a lot of extra windage. It's visible right here in this video, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's an excellent point and another perspective on seeing that line deflection. So here it goes. You can just see it spooling out to the right, like Peter mentioned. In terms of the surface float line, as I said, it performed exactly as expected. You can see the way that it's deployed out straight away from the barge. This is exactly what you want with a disabled vessel, because it gives the rescuing tug a ton of room to come sweep in and pick up the line.
Yep, and they can stay on the upwind side, which is where you want to be. You don't want to be on the downwind side.
So just to sum it all up, what are our major takeaways? Well, that all the devices that were identified from the previous study were competitive. They all did what they set out to do. But when it comes to defining the best technology, it's going to be situationally dependent. So that sort of goes back to what I was talking about with tankers and how this pyrotechnics might not be the best there. So when we look at pneumatics, they're going to be the standard. They're safe and effective, a great way to make contact. They really met all the marks. In terms of the float line, this is something that would be fantastic to have on board a number of ships. They're really suited to high wind and seas. And something that I just touched on before is that they can be dropped in the water long before the rescue tug is even in the area. Once the ship knows that it's disabled and in need of help, they can drop this in the water, communicate with the tug, and let them know where it's streamed out, what the heading is, and where to pick it up, how long it is. And all the tug needs to do is pick it up out of the water, past the towing gear, and they're on their way.
Yep.
Pyrotechnics.
Well, I was just going to add, in a situation where if you had a disabled vessel that's, only a short distance from shore, and short distance is really anything less than 25 miles, I would say, this is a huge advantage because it's a real time saver. And particularly if wind speeds are high and significant wave heights are high, you can really get away from all that messing around. It's a dangerous situation there if you're trying to pass those lines in close proximity. The relative motions of the two vessels, all that stuff can be avoided with the float line, which is why we stress that they're well suited for these types of scenarios where time's of the essence and weather not so good.
Yeah, that's right. And with Pyrotechnics, like I said, they're really fantastic devices. However, that safety risk is serious, and it should be considered when it comes to what types of vessels they're going to be interacting with and how the crew is going to be on board. And really, it's important to note that although they do achieve what they set out to do, there is an inherent risk of fire and injury to crew that comes with these devices. And then finally, just wanted to make one more point about build quality, that when it comes to selecting one of these devices, the type isn't the only important thing. It's really important to make sure the device is well made, it's got the right materials and the right manufacturing, because that's going to be what's important for efficient and, more importantly, reliable use. So I'd like to open up now for any questions that any of you might have for me or Peter. Thank you again for letting us speak today. Yeah, I see Jim's got a hand up.
I sure like those drone pictures there. You engineers know how to put together a good presentation. Thanks. Another disadvantage of those pyros are they've got an expiration date on the canisters inside, 42 months from date of manufacture. So of course people are going to be replacing their flares and whatnot, but that's another disadvantage.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. And it's it creates a bit of a disadvantage for anyone to want to conduct drills with them, right? Because or it encourages people to drill with expired stuff. Also, not great. That is a great point.
And I've fired those pyros myself, and in training exercises, another factor, as the wind increases, sometimes they tend to seek upwind, the projectile, and I sure noticed there weren't any white caps the day you guys were out there. There wasn't too much wind, but that was still enough to deflect that line. So I think that's an important consideration.
Absolutely.
I wondered if the manufacturers have some specific guidance that they send out with their product. Do we fire downwind? Do we fire crosswind? Do we fire as circumstances allow? How close can you get? What's prudent? There's a lot of variability, but I should think there'd be some sort of guidance from the manufacturers too.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I think all these manufacturers would tell you that to the extent you can, try to fire downwind and not crosswind, because that's going to result in the best accuracy. But anyone who's been in the field knows that you don't always have that option. There may be one side of the vessel that's unsafe to approach, or the vessel may be grounded, who knows, but it's really got to be able to do it all. And your point is a good one, which is, hey, you guys, you tested on it's not like it was blowing 40 on the day we did this test, it was blowing 15 knots. And that was enough to cause the bite of the line to blow completely downwind of the barge. So imagine trying to fire this thing in 40 knots, 50 knots wind, especially if you can't execute a downwind shot. It could be not doable. I think it's a great point too, Jim, about these things wanting to head upwind as wind speeds increase. And I think what's going on there is that deflection on the line itself, the shot line that it's carrying, is so great that it's actually pulling on the tail of the projectile and turning the projectile itself into the wind. I wonder if some of this video feedback that we've provided to the manufacturers will help them improve their products, because it was evident to me that selection of a slightly more costly but more flexible braided line would really do away with some of these problems.
We've also got a hand from Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Peter and Kevin there. The presentation was very nicely done, but if you guys could, and if necessary, Joe, jump in. Could you mention just a little bit about the participation that you had from the manufacturers and what information they took away, and what the plan is for disseminating this information through the industry?
Sure. So I guess the carrot to get all of these manufacturers to want to participate on a voluntary basis, well, there was two really. One was, hey, here's an opportunity for you to show that your product is the best in the field. Are you interested? And so that was one. And so ResTech jumped at it immediately. The other carrot was, we made it clear from the beginning that this would be very public report when it was done, and that the video footage that we captured, we would make available to them in a raw form that they could then take and edit and create their own marketing materials with. And so it was not difficult to get everyone to want to participate, except for COVID. So COVID made it hard for the ResTech team. They didn't know until just days prior that they were actually going to be able to travel over from Norway. And that was causing them a lot of grief, and they were struggling. You know, they had lined up some product reps in the US that could attend if they weren't able to make it, but in the end they were able to come. We had folks from Houston attending, Portland, and Ferndale for Samson. So everybody had someone that's either involved at a leadership level of these companies, or is as a designated sales representative or a distributor, was on board, and they were familiar with the equipment. And even in cases where there weren't executive level folks from these manufacturing companies on board, those executives were super aware of what was going on and have been in communication with me since, asking, when can we get this footage? And I have supplied the footage as promised on a share file site, but I have not provided them the report or this presentation because that's contingent on the approval that we're voting on here today, right? And once we have authorization, they will distribute it. They've all asked to receive a copy.
Okay.
Did I hit them all, Steve, or was there one more?
Yeah, I was thinking, did we have a plan for publication, or are we soliciting publication in industry mags?
So I don't know, but my guess, the way this has gone with the other stuff we've done for you guys, is that Alan and I will we'll chat with Brooke and Maggie at Glosten and talk about how do we get the word out. I mean, I think it's good for both Glosten and RCAC to get this stuff out there, and it is an interesting little study and some great footage. So we'll make a plan. And at this point, when we do something like that, then the Glosten work that's involved in polishing up an article or putting together some images or whatever is all on our own dollar. So we'll coordinate with Alan on that, and RCAC in general. But we would like to know as soon as possible when we have authorization to distribute the report. So I'd like to provide that to these manufacturers as soon as possible. They've all been bugging me repeatedly.
Okay, well, I'm hoping we'll have that authorization in about 3 or 4 minutes here.
Okay.
Just one other thing I wanted to put out for the board and the other people who are with us today is that Glosten has gone beyond what could be expected on working the last couple of projects for us, to the point of going, this was really good stuff, and we kind of running against our budget, but we're going to finish it out anyway. So I really want to thank you guys for having that attitude and helping us with this stuff. So with that, I'll turn her over to Joe and the rest of the group.
Brooke, did you have something?
I was just going to springboard off of Steve's comment about Glosten. The articles, the last two we have gotten in international publications, has been a result of the legwork that they've done. And they they do really good writing. They've been a pleasure to work with on the public facing side, and I just wanted to give them that kudos.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke. We try to do our best.
And I will just throw in my 2 cents. I've been involved in a couple of rescues where we've had 5 shots with the old shoulder held 4570 cartridge, and nothing ever goes the way you want it. Things get excited, and that was in 60 plus knots of wind, so it was rather exciting. So with that, this is a action item. If somebody would like to make the motion to accept this field trial of the messenger line throwing device.
Mr. Chair, is Michael and Shanga. I so move.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Ben, second.
Thank you, Ben. Is there any objections? Hearing none, that project is accepted by the board. Thank you, fellas.